Thank you. So to introduce myself, my name is Vaibhav Gujral. I have over 11 years of experience now, and I'm a Microsoft certified Azure architect. I hold few other certifications too. I want to become a full-time blogger and community champion, and my interests outside technology also include value investing and photography, and I have acquired as a New Year resolution to try out astronomy this year. And I am married to Geeta and I have two kids, happily married and blessed with kids. My blog address is there. I don't contribute more, but I plan to do more. And here are my Twitter handle and other addresses where you can reach out to me in case you want to. Jumping on the agenda before, it's all about microservices, what are microservices and how they differ from monolithic systems, what are their characteristics, how we can approach designing microservices, what are the considerations we should keep in mind, and finally a quick demo around Service Fabric Cluster, which is Azure service for hosting microservices. But before I jump on to the first slide, may I know how many of you have actually been using microservices? Quite a few. So I would try to cover a bit basics about microservices. What are they, and why do we really need them? How do we evolve to use microservices architecture? To understand that, the first thing we should understand is what are monolithic applications. Until unless we don't understand what are monolithics, we cannot actually come to understand what are microservices and what advantages they bring on board. So traditionally, when we have been working on applications, it's mostly have been N-tier applications. All our enterprise applications have at least 3 layers in that. The first being the presentation layer, which has all the HTMLs and Angular and other JavaScript files. The second being the database layer, which hosts generally a relational database management system. And the centerpiece being the server-side component, which actually handles all the requests and processes our data from database, reads, writes to the database, and processes our request, returns responses, generates all the view for HTML. That server-side component can have multiple layers, or we can call it as a business layer. That is a perfect example of a monolithic application. The main criteria of a monolithic application is, even though it has multiple layers, it is still compiled and deployed as a single unit of execution. So what I mean to say is, even if we have to change a single line of code, we still deploy a full bundle together. We don't just push or deploy a single module or component. So that's not the only one thing. Once it even gets deployed, it all runs inside a single process. So if one thing fails, one module fails, it brings down the complete monolithic component and ultimately brings down our enterprise systems. It has advantages. We can horizontally scale it as much as we want, as many instances we want behind a load balancer, but it has its own sets of challenges. It is quite successful. Almost 70% of the applications right now use those monolithic systems, but there are few challenges. The primary being, as I said, the change cycles are very tight. What I mean to say is, as soon as we make a small change, we have to deploy a full application or a full, and we have to completely rebuild it, the whole system together and deploy it, rather than the only component or module which needed the change. The second being, we also lose the modular boundaries. Everyone will agree that when we start working on a monolithic system, we do have our different modules. We start with clear modular boundaries, but when the system begins to grow, evolve, there is a stage in which the modular boundaries start overlapping each other. So if we may try to make a change in one module, we have to go and look into other module and make changes in that. So ultimately, we lose the modularity of the complete system. The third being scalability and resiliency issues. Scalability, when I said it's good that we can scale it up to a certain level, but again, if we have to just scale, let's say a single module or a single component, we have to scale everything. So that brings cost with it, because we cannot a component is a lightweight, but a whole system is heavyweight, so which consumes more resources. And resiliency, if, as I said before, if one component fails, everything fails. All these challenges are actually taken care well by microservices. We can address all these challenges. Before we jump onto the characteristics of microservices, let's see what and how we define microservices. Wikipedia says it's a variant of service-oriented architecture, SOA architectural style, where we structure an application into a set of loosely coupled services. Amazon says microservices are an architectural and organizational approach to software development where software is composed of small independent services that communicate over well-defined APIs. These services are owned by small self-contained teams. Microsoft has defined it as an architecture where application is composed of small independent services. They all have tried to define microservices pretty well, but the definition that I liked the most was given by two software practitioners called James Lewis and Martin Fowler. They have published an article on internet about microservices architecture, and how they define it is the microservice architectural style is an approach to developing a single application as a suite of small services, each running in its own process and communicating with lightweight mechanism, often an HTTP resource API. These services are built around business capabilities and independently deployable by fully automated deployment machinery. There is a bare minimum of centralized management of these services, which may be written in different programming languages and use different data storage techniques. Short, precise, and complete definition for a microservice. If our microservice can qualify for all these properties, it's a very well written, designed microservice. I have taken the same, referred the same article which Martin Fowler has written, and he has specified, he has mentioned a pictorial difference between monolithic and microservices. So here I am trying to show a monolithic application where we have in the box, which it has 5 components. Whenever we are trying to scale it or deploy it, it always goes as a single box. All the 5 components are deployed and scaled together. Whereas in a microservices world, we have all the independent components packaged in independent services, and they are scaled and deployed independently in their own process, as depicted in the picture. I tried to be a little bit more creative, so I have created this to be more precise. So this is the more traditional look of our monolithic applications, where we used to had a server, web server or app server, where our clients used to reach out and it used to hit a database server. It was the central hub which used to do all the processing and return back. If one module faults, everything used to go down. This is being replaced by multiple services. We have an API gateway in between. I'm going to cover that in later slides, but the role of a gateway here is to identify the incoming request and delegate it to the individual independent service, whichever can handle that request. So the good part here is if service 1 goes down, it doesn't impact any of the other services, and our system is still up and running. So the major difference between monolithic and microservices boils down to basically one word: changeability. Traditionally, whenever we have been working on monolithic systems, as they become too big to fail, the focus of complete development team and support team shifts from development and technology towards maintenance and support. People just focus, they channelize their energies to just keep things working as they are supposed to be working. They are scared to try out new things because they cannot change. They cannot change the existing systems. They know if they will change one module, it will bring down everything. And that changeability is the great feature which microservices offer. These microservices can be considered as services which can be plugged and played. We can just bring down services and replace them with the newer services without impacting rest of the services. And this changeability feature is really the best feature of microservices. Going through all the definitions that we read and the differences between monolithic and microservices, here are the few characteristics which we can list down about microservices. The first one being it represents a single business capability. It is whenever we are working on designing a microservice, it should only address a single responsibility. It might be a single business functional requirement or a business non-functional requirement, but it should always focus on a single requirement. If it addresses more than one, it's not a microservice. The second one being, if we have microservice which focuses on a single requirement, it's going to be a small code base, it's going to be a small development work, hence it results in a small number of team members. Each of the microservices are designed to run in separate process, and they can communicate with each other through two different ways. One is through the means of APIs. Once we deploy our services, they can be exposed as APIs and can be consumed by other services and outside world. The other pattern being the messaging pattern, where we can use services like Azure Service Bus, where we can write down the messages in the messaging store and our services can keep on picking up from there. Another key feature is microservices are designed in such a way that they do not share the data store. They should have their own different data store, and they should have their own separate code base. The idea behind separate code base and separate data store is to make them loosely coupled, and so that they can be deployed independently. If we have data schema which is shared across services, or if we have microservices which share same code base, then it's really impossible to deploy them independently and keep them loosely coupled. Finally, no technology barrier. If we have multiple microservices in our project, in our system, each of the microservice can be developed independently using any technology, any platform, any framework of our choice. Because ultimately, as I said, all our communication is going to happen over APIs or messaging patterns, not through the code. Most of you would be thinking, if microservices talk about services, then how is it different from SOA, service-oriented architecture? Because even Wikipedia says it's a SOA type architecture. So that's pretty right. I won't say that assumption is wrong. There are lots of features which are same because it's an extension of service-oriented architecture, but there are key differences among those. So we can say microservices are a subset of SOA, or SOA is a superset of microservices. An example for microservice for SOA could be Enterprise Service Bus. Few key differences that can be noted between SOA style services and microservices are, in microservices, the intent is to deploy them independently and keep them loosely coupled as much as possible, but that's not the case with SOA style services. Microservices are lightweight as they only address a single responsibility, whereas SOA type style services are monolithic in nature. Microservices need to have same data store, need to have different data stores, whereas SOA shares same data source. So these are the three critical differences between SOA and microservices, which we should be aware of. So looking at these characteristics, there are certain benefits which we can avail from microservices. I'm pretty sure that most of the people here today have been using agile frameworks in their projects. So looking at the characteristics that microservices offer, like independently deployable, changeable, all those features actually are very well versed with agility. The primary benefit that we get out of using microservices is that it brings agility on board. It becomes pretty easy to maintain our releases and to push our bug fixes, because we only deploy the service which needs a bug fix, or in which feature is updated or feature is introduced. and we don't deploy the code which is not touched, which is not changed, that keeps running as is. Small code, small teams. As I said in the previous slide also, that's one of the characteristics, because a microservice is designed to address only a single responsibility. There is a rule called two-pizza rule. It's not a industry standard, but it's just a joke that if you cannot feed your team in 2 pizzas over lunch, then your microservice is too big. You have to drill down your microservice. Mix of technologies, similar to previous slide, we can choose our technology of choice. It brings resiliency to system. If we deploy a service with a breaking change and it fails, it introduces a fault in the system. It's pretty simple, it's pretty easier to bring it down, roll back or roll forward the fix for that without impacting the other services. Just the only word of caution there is every service should be able to handle faults using technologies like circuit breaker or other technologies, so that if one of these services goes down, the working services doesn't go down. Scalability, since we can deploy our services independently, we can scale them independently up to any demand that we want without impacting without scaling other services. Data isolation, since I talked about having each microservice having a different data store, that brings in picture the data isolation. Because we have different data store, we don't have conflicts between the database schemas, and that isolates our data for each service. That ensures that we don't have data issues. These are the few companies that I read about while preparing this session who have been using microservices aggressively. It started with Netflix. If you are interested in learning more about microservices, just go and read about Netflix and microservices. You will get lots of articles. Amazon, Hootsuite, Microsoft, SoundCloud, Spotify, Disney, they all are using microservices aggressively. They all used to be in monolithic systems, but they have replaced their systems with microservices. And they have their case studies available online. So now when we understand what is a microservice, what are its characteristics, and what are they, it's pretty important for us being developers to understand what are the considerations that we should be aware of when we are going to develop a microservice. The primary one is the service boundary. As I said initially, that a microservice is designed to only support a single responsibility. So the primary action for developers or stakeholders in that scenario is to identify the perfect service boundary for a microservice. Until and unless we don't identify a service boundary, it's going to create conflicts and clashes after the code is deployed to the production. So before we can jump onto the development, the first step in this process is to identify the service boundaries. As I said, the most general rule, a service should be doing only one thing. And it's not designed across the development functionalities like database access and stuff like that. It has to be circled around business capabilities. It has to be structured around business domains. It should support loose coupling, and it should support high functional cohesion. Now, what do you mean by loose coupling and functional cohesion? A microservice is a loosely coupled if we can change one service without impacting any of the other services. And on the other side, it's a highly cohesive if it has a single well-defined purpose which is inclined towards the business capabilities, not to the other horizontal layers. A service should encapsulate domain knowledge and abstract that knowledge from clients. Being a client, if I'm using Netflix, I don't care how the media is acquired, I just care about if it is getting streamed or not. So one architectural style or the design methodology that we can use for designing our microservices is known as domain-driven design. It's a quite famous design methodology, which I am sure most of you would have heard of it before. If not, I am going to cover in the upcoming slides, so that will give you a brief idea how we can use domain-driven design to actually design our microservices. Domain-driven design is an approach to software development for complex needs by connecting the implementation to an evolving model. Basically, in domain-driven design, we try to understand the business domain and try to put it in paper, or it's just a bird-eye view of the business domain, the business problem that we are going to address. It comprises of basically two phases, strategic and tactical. In the strategic one, it's just a bird eye view. We define the overview or the bird eye view or the large scale structure of the system. How does the system looks like? And it ensures that the architecture is based on the business capabilities and not non-business capabilities. On the other side, once strategic design is complete, the next phase in it is called as tactical DDD, in which we drill down into deep dive into the business domain. We define our subdomains, we define our entities, we define our microservices based on those entities. The first step, as I said, was strategic design. In this, the main objective is to identify the bird eye view of the system. It starts by modeling the business domain and creating a domain model. I'm not sure if you have seen a domain model, but it lists down the different aspects of a business domain or the business problem that we are going to address. It's basically just an abstract. It doesn't include any technological terms, rather than it includes all the business terms. It distills and organizes domain knowledge and provides a common language for development team as well as the domain experts, so that the knowledge can be transferred from domain experts to the developers. It starts by mapping all the business functions and their connections. As I said, it's a link between domain experts and development team. So it includes stakeholders like domain experts, software architects, and other business stakeholders. So I just tried to drill down an e-commerce business domain. If we are trying to develop a microservices-based architecture for an e-commerce platform, so I could think of these business domains or subdomains that at a business domain level. Like it might include orders, payments, recommendations, shipping, products. Each of them exist as a subdomain within the overall e-commerce domain. This is identified as part of the first step of the strategic domain, where we analyze the existing business domain. The next step in strategic design is to identify the bounded context. Before I define what is bounded context, I would like to take an example of general day-to-day language. When we speak to each other, any word can have different meaning in different context. For example, if I want to speak about the word well, it might be, if I'm saying, yeah, I am well, it means I am good. Whereas if I'm referring to a hole which is digged in the ground, it's also called as well. They are from different contexts and they mean different. On the same terms, when we have our applications, our microservices defined on business domains, within those business domains, we actually represent real-time objects, and those real-time objects can actually have different meanings in different contexts of different services. And those services are bounded to each service, and that is why it's called as bounded contexts. So as I said, domain model, when we come up with domain model, if you will see the pre-model that I have shown here, most of these represent a real world object like order, payment, product. They all represent entities, and they have different meanings for different services. For example, in my order service, I don't care about buyer's address or seller's address. I just care about seller's name, not the seller's address or seller's TIN number or SSN number and so on. So bounded context can actually, it's useful to design separate models that represents the same real world objects in two different contexts. These are not necessarily isolated from each other. For example, orders can have all the specifications within order service, but it might have a smaller specification in other services. So they are not necessarily isolated, but they can be if they are altogether different. Here I've tried to depict how context, what is the whole outcome of the step where we design bounded context or identify bounded context. This is how we do. We identify the different contexts with different objects which are shared across our business domains. For example, our orders is the core system in e-commerce, because our order service is going to interact with most of the other services, and our order object is going to be shared across all the other services. When I say shared across, each of the other service will have their own bounded context for that order, though it might be a subset of the actual real order object within order service. In other words, the order service can own that orders object, but it will have altogether different context in different services. So once we have those identified bounded contexts, the next step we come across the tactical design, where we actually do a deep dive on the domain model, where we identify different entities, aggregates, and different objects that we can use in our microservices. So the first one being the entities, it's quite clear from the name. It's a unique identity which has its own identifier which can be defined as an entity. It has, for example, product, user, customer, they all fall into entities. Second being value objects which hold only certain values and they don't have any identity. For example, colors, date and times, and so on. Next one being aggregates. Aggregates are combination of entities, and they can span across multiple entities. And one of those entities can be considered as a root entity, and based on that root entity, we can do a lookup for other entities. For example, customer has products and customer has orders and orders has products. So those all together form an aggregate, whereas customer, product, and order all are different entities. Then we have something known as domain and application services within our tactical design, which we identify. Together they are known as services, but we can classify those services into two different categories: domain services and application services. Domain services actually encapsulate all the domain logic, whereas application services provide technical functionalities such as authentication and SSL, etc. Finally, last but not the least, the domain events. They are used to notify all the other parts of the system. For example, an order has been placed. Order service has to publish this to the other services so that they can do their shipping. For example, shipping service can subscribe to the domain event called an order is placed from the order service. But one point to notice here is that our event should not be very generic. For example, we cannot just have an event called a record is inserted. It should be pretty precise and it should bind to a domain. It should have some meaning in the business domain, like an order has been created or an order has been cancelled. It cannot be just like a record has been inserted, which is very generic. Finally, the last step in tactical design is to identify our microservices. Once we have our business domain defined, the domain model ready, once we deep dive into them and identify the different entities and aggregates, then the last task in this is to, based on those entities and the business domain model, is to identify the microservices that we are going to develop. As a general principle, Microservices should not be smaller than an aggregate and should not be larger than a bounded context. What it means is it should it can comprise of multiple entities, but it should never cross a business bounded context, or in other words, it should always address a single responsibility, because each bounded context is binded to a single responsibility or a single subdomain within the business domain. So just to brief about domain-driven design, these are the 4 steps which are covered as part of a domain-driven design. It's a topic which can be covered in its own session. Just in case if you guys are interested, you can go and read about domain-driven design by a book called Domain-Driven Design itself. It's authored by a folk called Eric Evans, which is a very good and popular book. You can go and check it out in case you are interested. So finally, before you finalize your microservices using domain-driven design or any other approach, ensure that your microservice fulfills a single responsibility and it doesn't do multiple things. Another thing is, as our system grows, it's not going to have only a single microservice. As we said, a microservice will have single responsibility. It's quite obvious our system is going to be comprised of multiple services, and those services are going to communicate with each other. So we have to ensure that we design our microservices in such a way that there are no chatty calls. When I say chatty calls, there should not be overly calls, like they are communicating with each other too much. So if that is the case, then that's a symptom that we have not designed our microservices correctly. It should just be precise and up to an acceptable level. Each service should be small enough so that it can be managed by a small team. There are no interdependencies. When I say interdependencies, each service should be deployable independently. Another thing to be considering that we should consider while identifying our microservices should be they should not be tightly coupled, because by design microservices are supposed to be loosely coupled. If they are tightly coupled, it actually kills the principle of microservices. Finally, we should also ensure that whenever we are identifying our microservices and the respective data stores, it should not result in data consistency and integrity issues. I'm going to cover that in a later slide, what type of data consistency and integrity issues can come in if we are going to have different data stores for each microservice, but we should ensure that we don't have those issues in our system. As I said, each microservice should be designed to have its own set of data. It should manage its own data, but it can lead to challenges like data consistency and data integrity. It's fine for services to, when I said different data stores, I mean to say that they should have different data schemas. There should not be schema sharing between those services. So we can have all the data stores being represented by a single physical database server, but they should actually go and hit, each service should have its own set of database tables or schemas that they use. That's how they can achieve loose coupling. If they are going to share schema with each other, it's going to make them tightly coupled. Eventual consistency, it cannot be achieved in every case, I'm sure, wherever we need transactions especially, but there are lots of scenarios, use cases where we can address most of the data consistency issues using eventual consistency. So wherever you can, you should utilize it. When I was preparing this slide, I got a reference for 2 patterns called as scheduler agent supervisor and compensating transaction pattern, which I am not aware of, but the recommendation is if we are going to use transactions, these are the patterns that we should go and really look out for. As I was saying earlier, for strong consistency, one service may represent the source of truth for a given entity. For example, order service can be a source of truth for an order entity, which is exposed through an API. Other services might hold their own copy of the data or the subset of the data. For example, order details can be captured by other services and they can maintain at their own data store, which can be subset of the actual order entity which was created by the order service. That is eventually consistent with the master data but not considered the source of truth. So that is a very important point. Whenever we are defining our entities and bounded contexts, we should understand and define the actual source service which is going to own a entity. The next consideration that we should be thinking about when designing microservices is related to network and latency. It's pretty exciting to have smaller services, smaller code bases, and play around them and deploy them independently. But the point to consider here is, if we are going to break our monolithic systems into a set of microservices, and as that number of microservices grow, their internal communication is also going to increase. Earlier in monolithic, it's all within the same process, so it never mattered. But when we are going to have different microservices, they are going to communicate between themselves. So it can result in more inter-service communication, and there might be network latency as well because of those inter-service communication. So as I was saying initially in second or third slide, that there are two mechanisms how we can handle the communication between those services and with outside world. The first one being the synchronous communication, where we can expose our services as APIs, most likely HTTP based, or it can within inter services we can also utilize a protocol called RPC, where we can use remoting and we can call our services because they run on this same server. The other approach being the asynchronous one, where we can do some sort of load leveling if we cannot scale our services very high and we see lots of load coming into our system. We can use messaging patterns for it, where we can introduce event hubs or service bus queues and topics, where we can write down the incoming messages and our services can pick it up from there. That sort of communication is referred to as asynchronous. It also has its own pros and cons, but depending upon what works best for us, we can either consume our services as APIs or we can utilize a messaging pattern. Complexity, on pretty much on the same lines as network thing. As the number of services grow and they behave as a single system on a whole, it really becomes complex system to maintain all those systems. Though each service is owned by a different team and they have their own source code and data store, but to maintain them as a whole, it becomes a complex system. Communication between clients and application or our services. This is very critical. When I work in a project where we have 50 microservices. So we cannot expose all the 50 microservices endpoints, or all are exposed as APIs, but we cannot expose all 50 API URLs to our clients. They are going to kill us because our service one does one activity, our second service does second activity. So for performing those 50 activities, they are not going to hit 50 different URLs. So we have to address that situation, and as I was saying initially, there is a component called gateways, API gateways, or there is another concept called API management, through which we can get away from this problem and we can expose just a single endpoint or a URL to the client and leave it to the gateway or the API management tool to decide where it should delegate the incoming request. So as I was saying, there are basically two types of APIs: public APIs that client applications call backend APIs that are used for inter-service communication. In my current project, we use RPC for inter-service communications and REST-based API for our clients so that they can post and get and do all the HTTP verbs. Few considerations in choosing which approach to go, whether to API or our REST calls or RPC. We have to consider different pros and cons of both approach. For example, RPC is more efficient in different use cases than REST, whereas REST is accessible over internet and it's standardized, it's industry standard, so it all depends on, we should go through all those. Even the cost is a factor for identifying RPC. Serialization, RPC and REST APIs have different serialization mechanisms, so that can also be one of the criteria to choose. As I was saying about API gateways, they sit between the clients and the services. They behave as reverse proxies. They route incoming requests to different services. They may also perform few of the other activities like authentication, SSL termination, and so on. There is a bunch of stuff that we can take care of in API gateways. Couple of options that we have to be used in Azure are Azure API Management or Azure API Gateway. Next comes to the monitoring. If we have multiple microservices in our system, it becomes really very difficult to pinpoint the service which has faulted, and within a service, where did the fault happen. So it becomes really critical to capture telemetry from each of those microservices so that we can handle faults or exceptions whenever they occur. As I said, it's critical for tracking what's happening across services. It's not only related to fault or exceptions. When we are deploying our services, we should be aware of what's happening in our services. We should log and monitor all the telemetry. A concept that can be used here is known as distributed tracing. Since we have different services and each one will have their own bounded context, how are we going to relate our transactions between those services? So as we were talking about a real source of truth for our main entity, for example, order service for order, in that we can generate a correlation ID for our order object, and whenever we are passing it to the next service, we can pass that correlation ID to the next service. Till the time the transaction is completed, we keep on passing forward that correlation ID and storing the telemetry, including the correlation ID, so that whenever we have to go and track down, we can track down based on that correlation ID. We in our project has been using Application Insights, which gives us a good interface on Azure portal also to track down, and we have our own tracking identifiers using which we track down what's happening in which service. The primary, as I was saying, the primary benefit of moving towards microservices architecture is agility. We get agility out of it, because it supports changeability. So if if you remember what James Lewis and Martin Fowler has defined microservices, one of the criteria they have specified was that each of the microservices should not be only independently deployable, they should also be deployable through an automated means. It should be an automated deployment, not only independent one. So that's why the consideration that you should be aware of should be about continuous integration and continuous delivery. We should ensure our services are deployed up to the production environment, all in an automated manner. Continuous integration means code changes are frequently merged into the master branch using automated build and test processes to ensure that code is of production quality. Whereas continuous delivery means it is deployed towards the production, and it is deployed successfully to the production environment. Just to give an insight on how the deployment CI/CD pipeline changes from monolithic to microservices, this is how a traditional monolithic system deployment pipeline works. We have, even if we have to release one module or one component of a monolithic system, and if it fails, the complete system fails because all of them share a single CI/CD pipeline. Whereas moving towards microservices, we have independent pipelines for each of those services because they are deployed independently. So even if one of the services has breaking changes, it doesn't disturb other CI/CD pipelines. There are different options for updating our services. I'm sure you might have heard of it. The first one being the rolling updates, in which as soon as the new instances are deployed, the older ones are removed. And during the update process, the challenge that we see in this approach is at a single time, we have both newer version and older version running on few of the instances. So that might be a case of confusion and we might get different results. The second approach that is quite popular is blue-green deployments, in which we deploy the newer version, we validate it till the time it is not validated that it's behaving and working as expected. The older version is not removed. Once it's validated, older version is removed. The third one being canary release, in which the rollout is pretty slow in a controlled fashion, generally for a small number of customers, and as and when it is adapted and tested by that small set of customers, it is being released to a larger number of customers. So that covered all the design considerations that we should have while designing our microservices. Coming to the last leg of this, once we have our microservices ready and we have CI/CD pipelines, where should we go and host our microservices? So basically there are two different methodologies or two different tool sets that we can use. One is known as Service Orchestrator, which is an automated management tool which manages all our services running on dedicated virtual machines. The other one being serverless. I will come to serverless later, but for service orchestration, there are three services which are offered by Azure right now. The first one being Azure Service Fabric, which I have been using recently in my project. The other two being Service Fabric does support containers, but the module that I am using, it creates its own Windows virtual machines and deploy our services and manages all the infrastructure, but it supports containers now. The second being Azure Container Services, through which Docker, Kubernetes, Docker Swarm, and all those things are supported. The third one being the third service has been introduced pretty recently. It's a Kubernetes managed service offered by Azure, which is known as AKS. So I am still pretty new to containers, so I don't have much idea on ACS or AKS, but you can go and explore it. As I was saying, the second approach could be a serverless, where we can expose our APIs or microservices as functions as a service. One of the services that are serverless and can be utilized in this scenario are known as Azure Functions, which are serverless and which support different triggers. I have personally tried using HTTP triggers, which works great. There are certain other triggers too which we can use.
What's DCOS?
Domain Controller Operating System, I believe.
Oh.
I'm pretty new to those terms about containers, so I don't know. I have taken it from Microsoft website, MSDN. Finally, to choose which hosting platform we should go, whether orchestrator or serverless, I have not mentioned it here, but the primary being can be whether we should go with containers or not. But apart from that, there are different factors that we should consider, like manageability. Azure Functions, when you speak about, it's all serverless, so it's all managed. It's a part of Azure App Service, and it's only charged for the compute power that we use, only for our API calls during that time. Whereas in Service Fabric or Kubernetes cluster, it charges for all the underlying infrastructure for the time it has been existing there, irrespective of how many API calls we receive. But it gives us clusters, service fabric clusters or Kubernetes gives us much more control over our clusters and the nodes, whereas in Azure Functions we don't have control on the servers, we don't know on which infrastructure it is going to be executed. Portability is one of the features of containers. Containers are very portable, and that can be considered to choose the hosting platform. Okay, that's pretty much about the presentation that I had. I have majorly worked on microservices which are developed for Service Fabric and hosted in a Service Fabric. So Service Fabric is one of the offering from Azure which maintains all the virtual machines as nodes, and those collections of nodes is known as a cluster. Within each node, whenever we deploy a service, it goes and runs as an instance. We can scale up or down the number of instances for each service independently. And there is one concept which you should be aware of. They call it as stateless services or stateful services. In my project, we have been using all stateless services. When I say stateless, it doesn't mean that they cannot have state. The only purpose that Microsoft calls them stateless and stateful is a service which doesn't store state in Service Fabric nodes is a stateless. A service which stores state locally on a Service Fabric node is a stateful. So my stateless services can actually go and store my state in a different data source outside my Service Fabric. My Service Fabric still considers it as a stateless service because my services are not storing any state locally. So that's the only difference when Microsoft addresses services in Service Fabric context as stateless or stateful. So I have actually, for developing for Service Fabric, you need to have Service Fabric SDK, which can be installed through Web Platform Installer. The web page that you are seeing here, it's known as a Service Fabric Explorer, which gives you everything related to the health of the Service Fabric cluster. So I will quickly go through this, and I have utilized a sample which is shared by Microsoft for getting started with Service Fabric. You can go ahead and download it from GitHub site from Microsoft. So it has a combination of different services which include stateless as well as stateful. I will quickly demonstrate those two. So this is an Explorer. This is run since I have installed Service Fabric SDK. Just like when we install Azure SDK, it set up a emulator in our machine so that we can test our local development. Likewise, when we install Service Fabric SDK, it does creates a local instance of Service Fabric, which we can use for our local testing purpose. So I am right now running my local Service Fabric. That's why you can see in the URL it points to localhost. I can create a Service Fabric in Azure and it will just be different in a URL, and rest everything looks like same. So when I land on a Explorer homepage, it gives me a snapshot of what's running in my cluster. You can see here I have created a 5-node cluster. If I click on that, I can get a list of all my 5 nodes which are running. Each of those nodes are in healthy state. If any of them is in faulted state, it gives me a snapshot of that. I can further drill down on individual nodes and see what's happening in each of those nodes. If you will see on this left side, you will see that it shows a application named as Getting Started application. This is a application which I have deployed. This is the sample that I have deployed on my local cluster. So all my services can be part of a single application, or they might be part of different applications. As of now, all my services are running in same application. If we'll go to the home page here, you can see that it says I am running one application on 5 nodes and I have 5 services. And below there you can see 14 partitions, and below that you can also see 18 replicas. This 14 instances are instances for my individual services. I have specified altogether my 5 services are running in 14 different partitions. Plus there are 18 replicas, and all of them are in healthy state. I will show you my project quickly that I am running here. So I have a couple of backend services. I have a stateful backend service, stateless backend service. I have a web service using which I will showcase what my stateless and stateful services are about. And then you can see there is a project called Getting Started application. That is a service fabric application project which I need to include in my project so that I can add all these services as part of an application to my cluster. It defines all the configuration that is required to deploy my services as part of an application. I can go ahead and deploy this to Azure directly through publish here. And once I click that, it will give me an option to log into Azure account. Once I have that, it will automatically give me the list of existing clusters that I have, or I might opt to create a new one. I don't have a cluster in my subscription because it's too costly and I utilize MSDN subscription, so I cannot afford that on Azure, so I have been showing it locally. Quickly coming to, as I said, I have a web service also running on my cluster. So this is an interface where I can go ahead and show you my stateful service. Oops. It doesn't want me to show it.
You stop your service when you're queuing the public.
Oh yes. So that is one of the challenges I have seen. So if you want to keep your services running in local cluster, even after you stop it, you can go change it in properties. You can choose to keep application, and that way if you stop it, it will never delete it from the cluster even if you stop debugging it. And if you want to test it locally, you just need to go and click F5 or directly click on start. It will automatically deploy it on the local cluster. So we will see it will auto refresh it. I will quickly change the frequency to update it every 2 seconds. So as soon as the application and services are deployed, it will be reflected over here. So it's copying the application package and creating the application type. There it is. So I have my application created, but it's still deploying my services within that application. I can see my services, but their health state is unknown because it's ready now. Let me go here and The web service which is part of that application is opened at port 8081. Here we go. Let me go through this. So it's a basic service which I can keep on getting the count of the values that I have inserted. Since it's stateless, it doesn't store anything. But if I go to stateful backend services, I can keep on adding different values. Okay. Okay, I think it's already there. So I'm really not sure what count this is giving, but this is the stateless service. It doesn't. And here you are seeing a guest executable service. So within a service fabric, it gives us an option for us to run even a guest executable file within each virtual machine on node based on the instances that we specify. I have never personally tried it because I don't know where in which scenarios we might need it, but you might like to explore that too. I think that's pretty much about today's talk. Any questions?
I have a question. You mentioned like eventual consistency. So like if you update an order in the order service in another grounded context as order data, how does that eventually?
As I said, it will not be possible in every scenario, especially where we need transactions. So it might be required to have real-time consistency in certain use cases, but wherever we can have eventual consistency, we should go for it. So
How does the data eventually get updated? Is there a separate service running
that depends upon how we design our microservices, because each one will have its own set of data, and how we keep those different data pieces synced, that purely depends upon our architecture. We can have a new service spilled up or whatever we want to have. Just a disclosure, in our current project, we share a same data source. So it's against microservices principle. So we have seen lots of challenges dividing our database tables and keeping them separate. So I know that piece is very tricky, because it's pretty simple to say that we should have eventual consistency or we should keep those data stores as separate as possible, but it's in real world it's very, very difficult.
I feel like one of the key tenets to being successful at this is being flexible in your development approach and
Yes.
being willing to refactor code that you've created, right?
And I understand whatever blogs I have read, people who have started developing microservices from scratch, they are more successful, and people who try to convert monolithic applications into microservices, they always have trouble especially in database. Because components can be divided into different microservices, because people already have more different modules, but they still share the same data source, so dividing data source is really a challenge.
Actually, NFM is having some success, though, breaking up their monolith. But they're using Docker, and they're still pulling chunks of their monolith out. Docker is
And it is still, microservices architecture is still evolving, so I didn't get a single blog which works. I didn't get two blogs which mention the same approach. So I believe people are still exploring it, but it's a nice way, and especially with containers, what I understand, it's pretty quick, pretty easy.
So what exactly, as far as every microservice has one, a single responsibility, how small can that really get?
Okay.
That
Sorry.
The logical
We've heard all
end is
sorts of
you
things.
can have a microservice that adds two numbers.
Yes.
So what you can bind it to a single business subdomain is what I understand. For example, in my project, the best way we could think of is we have linked each of our microservice to a individual client. When we started with it, we had only 10 clients, but it has now crossed 50. So now we have again started revisiting that approach was not the perfect one. So we have to start visiting a different business approach towards it so that we can segregate our microservices. So it's a very hypothetical, and I think it's based on individual business domain that you're working on, how small you can have it.
I have read blogs that purists will say that if your microservice is more than one method, it's too big. Which I think is.
I mean, at some point,
It-
the overhead is not going to be working.
One team for one method?
Well, they don't do it the one thing.
Whatever guidance I read, it said that it should be linked to business capabilities and not to horizontal layers like authentication or a single method. So that
Earlier in your slide, you showed, a business subdomain. So like orders, for example, how much of an ordering process would be like an example that a microservice could take care of? Like,
the complete order processing. Like for example, we can divide orders and refund. I was thinking of if we can separate refund service through which we can handle the cancelled orders, and in orders service we can just see the placement of the orders. We can segregate a shipping service which handles the shipping of the orders, and we have a product service which owns the products, and order service fetches the product details from that service.
but then each of those services would need its own data model, even if one order is basically going to be just about the same.
That's the whole concept of microservices, and order service will own the order model. That will be the real truth of that. But other services can hold a subset of it, and
But
they
a separate copy of it.
separate copy of it.
So I don't see it seems like that to me is a cost, but what is the benefit that overcomes that?
Loosely coupled. Each service is loosely coupled.
I can scale that order service by a magnitude of 10 depending on my load, and I wouldn't have to worry about affecting the refund process or the shipping process.
But if you were changing like the data model of a order, wouldn't that have to propagate to every model, every service?
Not necessarily.
Not
Not necessarily.
If you were editing or deleting, yes, but if you're adding, not.
And I would only go and change in those services where it is required. There might be, for example, when an order service doesn't need sellers credentials or seller's SSN number or addresses. They just need seller name and that's it, and the products he is selling. So if I go ahead and change seller's data in seller service, I don't need to go and push everything in order service. So whatever fields are used by order service, if those are getting changed in seller service, then I have to go and update the model in order service too.
But on the other side of that, if I am using if I'm using like zip code in the data model, and it's strictly configured for U.S. zip code. Now I want to start selling to Canadians or something for some reason. But then I would not only have to change the structure in one location on a database where in a monolithic you just have your one data model on the database of here's my zip code. Now you have to change it on multiple areas.
We have to. We have to.
You would add a new field.
But
Old services and use the old field, then you add a new field for the Canadian field.
so I won't say we don't have to update at every place, but I think it would be required, but we don't have to update. I'm not sure what would be the best approach for that, but yeah, that's true.
But there's each replication of the database for each microservice does have kind of its own model based on its context, right? So like maybe one does for some Canadians and one maybe doesn't, so those.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It might depend upon business, how we address that address that problem. In case if we are going to change the actual schema, then we might have to go ahead and which is used by other services also. Then we have to change it in other services.
Order is probably not gonna have any addresses that exist in here. So you don't need the address for shipping or receiving or something like that. So, that's probably not on the order scheme.
Another interesting thing is that you can have version of web API services, so if you got to change somewhere, you version it and have one services change over to the new version as time goes on.
That might be a good way to do it. We can introduce API versioning in between.
Service Fabric has some features that support that, right?
Service Fabric doesn't care about it. We can deploy any number of versionings and handle it at routing level.
Get it host multiple versions at the same time.
We are handling in one of our services using routing. We have introduced V1 and V2. So our old services still use V1 API URL, but the new ones are using version 2.
So how are you managing dependencies? How are you doing dependency management in projects?
Dependency mapped.
Yeah, so this service, how do you know what depends on that service and what fields in that service?
That's what the most creepy thing I have understood. I was saying we have single data source as of now, which we have plans to segregate it in pure microservices terms. As of now, all our data resides in single data source.
I think you give up your compile time checks in favor of test time checks. So it's, because you can't compile these services against each other. So you have to
We
check
compile
those
them
ways.
separately actually. We don't compile all our services together. We have different,
Which is the benefit, right?
yeah.
We shouldn't even know about each other.
They don't know. We have 50 different repositories. Each repository has its own service. Each repository has a different
That's
service.
kind of my question too, is like, you have a monolithic application, do you break a contract between modules, right away, compiler or unit test? And so how do you address that issue with microservices? How do you find out before you deploy the?
We have our automation API tests in between before it makes it to the production.
Integration test.
Integration, functional and integration tests.
Is that end-to-end testing?
It's end-to-end. We first run our unit test cases before it is made into master branch. Then we have function and API test cases which are automated, which execute all our API calls and verify everything works, everything looks good.
I have a question about Service Fabric. Is that .NET only, or is that something that you can execute Java or Node?
If you are going to use the same way I have shown it to you, it's Windows only. It creates Windows nodes. But I was reading few documents and documents website. They are supporting containers now. And I was reading something about containers that we can in Kubernetes we can deploy side-by-side Windows and Linux. So I'm not sure where Service Fabric is on that part, but it does support containers. And if it's containers, I'm sure it's going to be Linux too.
The difference between Service Fabric and the Azure Kubernetes services is what? They're two different pieces, are they not?
They are two different pieces. Azure Kubernetes services provides you a Kubernetes cluster, is what I understand. And Service Fabric cluster, it's all inbuilt from Microsoft. And what Microsoft claims is most of their services are using Service Fabric cluster itself. But trust me, if you are starting with microservices on Azure, go with AKS. Don't go to Service Fabric. I feel what I have understood from there are few people in my office, in my company, who are evaluating AKS these days. So I have understood, at least by talking to them, that maintaining AKS clusters is super easy as compared to Service Fabric clusters.
It's a matter, it's just a level of control, and that's what the different service types with similar features are in Azure.
So
Level of control.
Service Fabric cluster runs few services to keep everything up, and on one good day, one of those services went down on our cluster without any interference from us. and it has resulted in all our services to be down for almost an hour. And it generally takes, we have an automated creation script using PowerShell. We use Octopus to create a new Service Fabric cluster. It takes almost 45 to 50 minutes for us to set up a blank cluster in Service Fabric. I'm not sure of what is the cost factor for Kubernetes AKS, but Service Fabric cluster is also expensive, because if I'm creating 5 nodes, each of those virtual machine costs me, plus it also includes few other resources like storage account and Key Vault and all that stuff.
You said you had about
Yeah.
But you don't have a restriction of having to have 5 nodes. So you can run it on less, but you don't have very often.
I have even tried to reduce the number of nodes, and it just goes into upgrading mode and it never came out. So that's why I'm not a fan of Service Fabric cluster. We have been using it, so it's good, it's great. But looking at the people who are evaluating AKS these days, I sincerely feel down the line we will be moving. One good thing with AKS is I think they support, since they support containers. I don't know how Service Fabric supports cluster containers. They support that. They have mentioned in website, but our services run in .NET framework. If we are planning to move to containers or Linux containers, we have to first change it to .NET Core, and we have to make them run there. So that is one of the showstopper for us, why we cannot adopt Linux containers right away. And people are suggesting us to not to go with Windows containers as of now. I'm not sure of the reasons, but I did check with few folks. They said if you are moving to containers, don't go to Windows, let it be Linux.
So you said you had about 50 microservices right now. So do you route everything through a gateway, or do you maintain a list of endpoints?
When I joined this team pretty late, but when this project was started, it seems, at that time there was no offering called API Gateway. So the folk who used to work, he spinned up a new instance of an app service which hosts an API. It handles most of the stuff. It does the routing for us, and it sends it back to us. Or probably it might not be app service. Probably I think it still runs in a cloud service. So. Because we have a rules engine which identifies which request should go to which service, and that runs in that. But for API gateways and API management, there are many other tools available outside of Microsoft also. Yes, so it's not restricted that we should use only API gateway or API management. There are lots of API management tools available outside.